Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
For 28 years, they have fought for justice for the 96 Liverpool fans who died at Hillsborough Stadium in 1989. Today, the victims' families applauded when they finally heard that 6 men would face criminal charges for their roles in Britain's worst sporting tragedy. Among them, the policeman who was match commander on the day, former Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield. He faces charges of manslaughter by gross negligence. And former West Yorkshire Police Chief Constable Sir Norman Betteson has been charged with misconduct. He said he was disappointed and would defend his innocence. Well, Judith Moritz is in Warrington for us this evening. Judith.
Yes, and you may remember that when the Hillsborough inquests finished last year, the jury concluded that the 96 Liverpool fans who died at Hillsborough were unlawfully killed. But of course, an inquest is not a criminal trial. No one was convicted then of any offence. And so the announcement of prosecutions today extends the long legal journey for the bereaved families and survivors. As you say, they've been fighting for nearly 3 decades. Today came the news that they will see yet more court appearances. The first defendants are due to appear before magistrates in August. They've had inquiries, investigations and inquests, but the Hillsborough families have never had public prosecutions. They've fought for nearly 30 years for this moment.
I'm absolutely delighted. We've got today everything we could have asked for. The decisions by the CPS, in my opinion, were correct, or are correct. And we look forward to the due process through the court of law.
In 1989, the police officer in charge at Hillsborough was David Duckenfield. He will now face prosecution.
There is sufficient evidence to charge former Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield with the manslaughter by gross negligence of 95 men, women and children.
The match commander ordered the opening of an exit gate through which the fans poured onto overcrowded terraces. He's charged with the manslaughter of all but one of the victims. Tony Bland died 4 years later, too late to be included in the charges. In the years after Hillsborough, Sir Norman Betteson rose through the ranks to become Chief Constable of Merseyside and later West Yorkshire. He's charged with misconduct in a public office, accused of lying about the fans being to blame. He said he's disappointed to be charged and will vigorously defend his innocence. Andrew Brooks is one of those killed at Hillsborough. He was 26. His sister Louise has long campaigned for justice and was in Warrington today to hear that charges will be brought.
It's another event where my parents haven't been alive to see it or to hear it, and it's not just my parents, it's other Hillsborough families who have gone to their graves never seen today.
The families were told that 23 suspects were originally considered for prosecution. In the event, 6 will face trial. Graham McCrell was Sheffield Wednesday company secretary. Responsible for safety, he's accused of failing to carry out his duties. Peter Metcalfe was the solicitor acting for South Yorkshire Police. He's charged with perverting the course of justice in relation to amendments made to police statements. At home today, he would not answer questions.
No comment, just the same as ever.
Right. Former Chief Superintendent Donald Denton in the middle here is also charged with perverting the course of justice, said to have overseen the process of altering the statements. Former Detective Chief Inspector Alan Foster faces the same charge, accused of being central to the process of changing statements. No one from the ambulance service is being prosecuted, and no organisation will face corporate charges over Hillsborough, which has disappointed some.
A mixed bag, a couple of names that we didn't expect and a few that we think have been omitted. There'll be 6 people facing criminal charges who might not have done if we hadn't have been resilient and all stuck together and fought this long fight.
Professor Phil Scraton has spent years working to expose what happened at Hillsborough and says the passage of time must have had an effect on the number of charges.
If we'd have had the kinds of investigation then that we've had now, and the kind of attention paid to the detail of prosecutable charges then as we have now, I think we'd have seen a lot more prosecutions.
The youngest to die at Hillsborough was just 10 years old, the oldest a pensioner. They were all unlawfully killed. There have long been calls for justice. Now, nearly 30 years after they died, those said to be responsible will face trial and the prospect of jail. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Warrington.
So as the rain teems down on a dismal night here in Merseyside, 6 people have been charged with criminal offences relating to the Hillsborough disaster. Among them is the former Chief Superintendent of South Yorkshire Police, David Duckenfield, who faces charges of manslaughter by gross negligence, and former Chief Constable Sir Norman Bettison, charged with misconduct in public office. Families of the 96 people who died in the disaster in 1989 gathered in Warrington to hear the decision by the Crown Prosecution Service. Friendships forged down the 28 years of fighting for justice. Waves, fist pumps, but as they arrived in Warrington this morning, all they had was hope. And then, after lengthy legal meetings, a dignified response, mindful that now fair trials are paramount, unfair comment dangerous.
28 years for justice. Now is a time for accountability. Thank you.
Trevor Hicks lost 2 daughters at Hillsborough.
There are no winners in this. You know, it doesn't bring anybody back from the disaster, but what it does do, it sends a message out of accountability, as we keep saying, that nobody but nobody's above the law, be it the police or anybody else.
Margaret Aspinall's son died on the Leppings Lane terrace.
We've changed the course, hopefully, for the future of the country. That, you know, don't ever give up hope, that if you carry on fighting, as the families have for all of them years, that things can change and things must change, and this must never happen again. No one should have to go through what these families have gone through for 28 years to get to try and get to the truth.
Those facing charges over Hillsborough include the former Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, the match commander on the day. He's charged with manslaughter by gross negligence. The CPS allege his failure to discharge his personal responsibilities contributed substantially to the deaths. Former West Yorkshire and Merseyside Chief Constable Norman Bettison is charged with 4 offences of misconduct in public office. They relate to alleged lies about his involvement in the aftermath of the disaster and the culpability of fans. But a long, separate inquiry into allegations that the police covered up their actions after the disaster also led to further charges being announced today. Peter Metcalfe, the solicitor who was acting for the South Yorkshire Police, is charged with intent to pervert the course of justice. That relates to changes he allegedly made to witness statements. 2 former South Yorkshire police officers, Donald Denton and Alan Foster, are also charged with intent to pervert the course of justice in connection with the altering of statements. And Graham Mackerel, who was Sheffield Wednesday's club secretary at the time, is charged with 3 offences relating to health and safety at sports grounds.
We've been smacked in the face on a number of occasions. Fortunately, the families have acted with the utmost of dignity and behaved themselves and fought for their loved ones.
95 Liverpool fans were crushed to death that April afternoon at an FA Cup semi-final at Sheffield Wednesday's Hillsborough Stadium. A generation of struggles would follow as families of those who died won 4 years later, and survivors of the crush fought to prove the fans were not to blame. Many, like Anne Williams, seen here on the left, would die before today was reached. The Taylor inquiry in Sheffield happened in the immediate aftermath. It did not blame the fans for what happened. There was an inquest, but the coroner set strict limits and it was later discredited. Private prosecutions would follow in the years. And then further campaigning led to the Hillsborough Independent Panel, which uncovered new material evidence. That in turn led to the second major inquest, the biggest and longest court proceedings in British legal history, concluding last year. Cheers, singing and embraces as that inquest returned a verdict that the fans were unlawfully killed. From Margaret Thatcher's visit to Sheffield at the time, down the decades, Hillsborough was never local, always national, and hence a parliamentary issue today.
Obviously, today will be a day of really mixed emotions for them, but I welcome the fact that charging decisions have been taken. I think that is an important step forward.
All of today's Hillsborough defendants, except David Duckenfield, will appear at Warrington Magistrates Court on August the 9th, a milestone on the long road to justice for the 96 victims, but not yet a destination. Well, after absorbing the news of these prosecutions with their lawyers, relatives and friends in Warrington earlier, those who have campaigned down the years collected their emotions for a moment or two, came out and then spoke to the waiting media. Louise Brooks lost her brother Andrew on the Leppings Lane terraces on that sunny April afternoon. And I began by asking her for her reaction to today's decision.
I feel angry and sad that, again, my parents have been deprived the right of ever being here with me. There's a lot of Hillsborough families who haven't lived to see this day.
But in that room today, inside this bland building, yeah, when you heard this news, just give us a sense of the reaction, the atmosphere in there.
Obviously, you know, we were quite pleased, but I think it was a relief as well, because when you fought for something for so long, and as I've just said, I fought for this longer than what Andrew was ever alive. And it's just
quite a thought, isn't it?
Well, you know, the conversations we've had, you know how it consumes not just my life, but the other Hillsborough family's life. And people don't understand the effect fighting something like this has on you, the toll it takes on you, you know, but the bonds you form. And I just hope that we Hillsborough families have shown the public, not only in this country but around the world, that if you never give up, you stay united and you're strong, and you always fight for what you believe in, then one day, hopefully, you will see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Do you think that lessons have been learned then from your long campaign over Hillsborough that can be taken up by others across the UK?
You know, Alex, it's absolutely disgraceful. You know, nobody knows the hell what we go through. And all this could have been over and done with 28 years ago. We families could have got on with their lives, and we would never have got over losing our loved ones, but also we could have not spent the last 4 or 5 years living out of hotels and, you know, sitting in a court. And this is what we do for our loved ones. You know, I would walk to the moon and back for my brother. There is nothing I wouldn't do for my brother and for my, you know, my parents.
Louise Brooks speaking to me a little earlier. Now, if there is one individual who perhaps more than anybody else was responsible for campaigning for the truth of what happened at Hillsborough and why, that person is surely Professor Phil Scraton of Queen's University in Belfast. He was with the families today in Warrington and said that the campaign has changed forever the way we respond to disasters in Britain. He told me today's was a landmark decision.
I think we have to put today into the context of the last 7 years. The Hillsborough Independent Panel report, 153 key findings, unequivocally arrested any kind of responsibility from the fans and placed culpability, responsibility as much as it could on all the organisations on the day. Then we have the inquest verdict, a very strong verdict of unlawfully killed. That verdict translated into 25 key issues raised by the jury of concerns. They too exonerated the fans. So what we then go to is a criminal investigation where the rules change. We're no longer in the situation where we're dealing with the balance of probabilities as the test. We're dealing with beyond reasonable doubt.
A lot of people here talking about accountability. Is that what today's about?
The issue of accountability, I believe, has been resolved. It's there for all to see. The public opinion on Hillsborough has switched massively from those early days when fans were being blamed, when drunkenness, ticketlessness, all of that was all in the public mind and a lot in the media's mind, to where we are today.
I'm struck today, people coming out of that room, out of that building, and saying immediately this is about something much, much wider than just Hillsborough. This is about justice, is about how you can take on the system in this country. It shouldn't have to be this way, but you can do it and you can win.
Well, as somebody who's close to a lot of cases, both in the north of Ireland, but also other cases that I've worked on here, from Dunblane right the way through Marchioness, etc. You know, one of the things I would say about the Hillsborough campaign, but also the processes that the Hillsborough campaign have been forced to go through, or the Hillsborough families and survivors have been forced to go through, is it's unequivocal that it has changed the tone of the debate as well as the debate itself. We still have to go through standards of proof and all the usual processes of a court of law. But what it's changed is the actual process itself and people's understanding that they can access justice and gain forms of accountability. It also means that we no longer only think of accountability in terms of people going to prison. We no longer think of accountability only in terms of people being held fine in a criminal court. People can be held accountable in a range of different forums, and that is exactly what has happened in Hillsborough. And we have the Hillsborough families and survivors in their long fight for justice to actually thank for that.
Professor Phil Scraton talking to me earlier. Well, let me leave you for now for the thought which has been expressed by many people, not least the families themselves in Warrington earlier today, which is that, quite properly, what matters above all now is that 6 men receive fair trials. With that, back to you in London.
Alex Thompson in Liverpool.
28 years after it happened, criminal charges have been levelled against 6 people in relation to the disaster at the Hillsborough Stadium that left 96 people dead. The charges relate both to the causes of the disaster itself and also to the conduct of various of the accused in the investigations afterwards. Well, Peter Marshall was at Hillsborough that day in 1989. He was working for Newsnight at the time and has made award-winning documentaries on the disaster since. And Peter, this is a very important day for the families.
It is. I've just been checking, Evan, on my calculator, and it's 10,300 days since the horrors of Hillsborough for those bereaved families and for the hundreds of traumatised survivors. And today has been a big day for them because at last they've got some individuals charged. Now, they're very pleased about that. There's some measure of satisfaction, although there's disappointment that those charges don't go further. There aren't more senior officers or even junior officers and civilians charged. But the Crown Prosecution Service have been pointing out that they are hamstrung because, for example, you can't charge organisations like Sheffield Wednesday Football Club or the South Yorkshire Ambulance Service because they've been entirely reconstituted. They're different organisations now than they were then, so there's no legal line of responsibility remaining. Hillsborough was a long time ago. It's been 3 decades of tortuous struggle to get here.
April the 15th, 1989. 56,000 people are at Hillsborough, Sheffield for an FA Cup semi-final. Even now, on the terrace behind the goal, packed with Liverpool fans, people are dying. With fans spilling onto the pitch to escape the crush, the game's abandoned. 96 people died. The match commander, South Yorkshire Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, had ordered a gate outside the ground to be opened, allowing fans crammed outside onto the already overcrowded terrace. Duckenfield will face charges of gross negligence manslaughter. The Crown Prosecution Service will allege Duckenfield's failure to discharge his responsibility at Hillsborough was extraordinarily bad. Sir Norman Bettison faces 4 charges of misconduct in public office. Sir Norman, who later became Chief Constable of Merseyside and later still West Yorkshire, an apparently glittering career, was a South Yorkshire superintendent at the time of Hillsborough. The CPS allege he told lies about his involvement in the aftermath of the disaster and the culpability of the fans. He maintained today he was innocent and will contest the charges. Peter Metcalfe, the solicitor for South Yorkshire Police during the original inquiry and the first discredited inquests, is accused of perverting the course of justice. Metcalfe reviewed accounts provided by officers and, according to the prosecutor, made suggestions for alterations, deletions and amendments for which there appears to be no justification. Metcalfe refused to speak to them.
No comment, just the same as ever.
Former South Yorkshire Chief Superintendent Don Denton and former Deputy Chief Inspector Alan Foster are also charged with perverting justice. Both are said to be involved in the statement amendment process. The sixth man to be charged is Graham McCrell. He was company secretary for Sheffield Wednesday, who owned Hillsborough. As safety officer at Hillsborough, he faces 2 charges alleging he failed to carry out his duties as required by law. For the bereaved families who've campaigned for nearly 30 years, this is a stage towards justice that for decades looked impossible. The announcement of charges was met with their applause.
I'm absolutely delighted. We've got today everything we could have asked for. The decisions by the CPS, in my opinion, were correct, or are correct. And we look forward to the due process through the court of law.
I'll give you a personal response, if I may. A mixed bag, a couple of names that we didn't expect, and a few that we think have been omitted.
Today's announcement's the outcome of 4 years of investigations by the police's Operation Resolve and the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and the CPS's deliberations over who may or may not be charged aren't finished yet. Files on West Midlands Police, the force which investigated South Yorkshire immediately after the disaster, giving them what amounted to a clean bill of health, are still being considered. The prosecutor says investigations are continuing. Prosecutors had been considering charging 23 individuals. They've settled today on 6. Circumstances may have restricted their options.
That situation in law is complex because they have to be very careful that they are taking a case, and they take major legal advice on this. They're taking a case not on the balance of probabilities but beyond reasonable doubt, and what that means is they have to be more than 50% sure that they will get a conviction before they set out. Otherwise, the case will be dismissed before it starts.
6 people charged?
Not enough, in my view, not enough. But 6 more than yesterday, and certainly 6 more than a few years ago when we couldn't have even dreamt of this.
Peter Marshall there.
I've been getting